in our charge community. So we have a way to look at this entire space that we have this February. We'll be looking at all of these endeavors through the lens of the Negro Question. Now, the Negro Question was first posed and imposed at the Mohawk Conference of 1890. And the Negro Question reads, what should be done with the presence of the troublesome Negro for maximum exploitation? So that being the case, we're going to look at the Negro Question and voter suppression. I have a great group of people, and someone I want to welcome back who we miss dearly is Miss Timberly Vogel, who's now at Texas A&M University in the PhD program, and she is still so very connected to us. I thank you, Timberly, so very much. We are awaiting what the conversation will provide, and good luck to all of you all.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon, for that wonderful intro. As he said, my name is Timberly Vogel. I am currently attending Texas A&M University, getting my PhD in sociology, and I will be moderating tonight's questionnaire or panel. But we did want to frame this and operate this as more of a fireside chat. So feel free to engage as much as you wish. Questions, comments, anything relevant to the topic. We are here and our panelists are here to engage with you all as much as possible and answer any questions you all have. So without further ado, I am honored to introduce our panelists today. First, I'll introduce Dr. Jacqueline Bridgman. Dr. Jacqueline Bridgman has been a member of the University of Wyoming College of Law and faculty and adjunct faculty in African American and Diaspora Studies since 2002. She's an Associate Dean of Academic Affairs for the College of Law in 2000. She became the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs for the College of Law in October 2010, and Associate Dean of Program Development and Kepler Professor of Law in August of 2013. She was appointed Interim Dean of the College of Law in November of 2013 and served in that capacity through 2015. She currently teaches in the areas of employment law, family law, torts, sports, entertainment law, and has taught African Americans and the law, African American history, Black politics, race, gender law, and social justice law. In 2017, she was appointed the interim and inaugural director of the School of Culture, Gender, and Social Justice at the University of Wyoming, in which she became the permanent director in 2019. Outside of the University of Wyoming, she also serves as a magistrate judge for the Albany County Integrated Juvenile Treatment Program, and she received her Bachelor's of Arts with honors from Stanford University and her JD from the University of Chicago. And our second panelist is Miss Linda Devine. Miss Linda Devine is a criminal defense attorney in Laramie, Wyoming. She received her undergraduate degree in history from the University of Wyoming and her JD from the University of Wyoming as well. Miss Devine is active in her community, advocating for criminal justice reform, police reform, and other forms of community advocacy. She is also the owner of Divine Eats, which is a community volunteer organization dedicated to community outreach, including voter outreach and bringing people together through food. So it is my absolute honor to be moderating these two experts on our discussion of the Negro Question and voter suppression. So I'd just like to start this discussion with allowing our panelists to share how you would define voter suppression and how are the forms we see today of it different than the historical forms that maybe seem more overt in those terms? And Dr. Bridgman, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Let's see. Make sure I get both parts of your question. Right? So how would I define voter suppression? For me, it happens in two parts, right? It's active measures to prevent people from voting in whatever form that might be. But the other side of this, and the side that I think we don't talk about as much, is lack of efforts to actually promote voting and engagement and enfranchisement for all people within your citizenry, right? So I think it's got those two pieces that tend to work together. And I think the second part of your question was present day voting suppression and how it differs from the past. I think in some ways it's a little less blatant but just as insidious as it's been really since the founding of this country, right? A lot of the tactics are the same, but in new forms. So I think oftentimes in the conversation today, we think these are new things or new tactics, and really they're just variations on an old thing that we've done again and again for hundreds of years now.
Linda. Hello?
Thank you. I guess just expanding a little bit on what Dr. Bridgman said, and kind of in reference also to Dr. Dixon talking about the 15th Amendment. You know, the 15th Amendment gave Black males the right to vote, right? And it wasn't till the 19th Amendment that women were given the right to vote. Shortly after that, and Dr. Bridgman knows a whole lot more about this than I do, is when they started the Black codes, which had a lot to do with voter suppression. They would initiate laws for loitering and things like that, which at that time there were a lot of Black men who weren't working. Then they would arrest them, then throw them into a farm working type of a thing. And it was right about that time too, I think more like in the 1870s, 60s, after the Civil War, is when a lot of states started passing laws that prohibited felons from voting. In fact, I just saw a question up there too about how mass incarceration has affected voting rights, and we can deal with that a little bit later. But I think that it's always been there, and I think that I would agree with Dr. Bridgman that it's less blatant now, and they try to suppress the vote in ways that it doesn't come right out and show the voter suppression.
Thank you for those. It is interesting to see and trace the historical efforts that have been implemented to suppress certain groups from voting or to disenfranchise them and not allow them to vote. And so I think it's perfect. We can go ahead and jump into sort of the carceral side. As both of you have a work experience as lawyers, how has the carceral system played a role in contributing to voter suppression? And with that, what does the role of mass incarceration play?
I can tackle that first if you don't mind, Dr. Bridgman. I see it frequently with clients of mine who are charged and sometimes convicted of felonies. And one of the things that the judge always advises them at the beginning of their arraignment, if they change a plea, and when they're sentenced, that becoming a felon, you lose a lot of rights. One of those, the right to vote. One of the probably most situations or clients that I had was when he was changing his plea, and when he was being sentenced, he told the judge that the hardest thing for him was that he wasn't going to be able to vote. Didn't care about losing his gun rights or a lot of other things, but that was a big one for him to swallow. There are a lot of states now that are starting to change that to restore voting rights for felons, but it varies from state to state. Here in Wyoming, in 2017, they passed the voter restoration rights, which if you were convicted of a nonviolent felon after 2017, your rights will automatically be restored once you complete any sentencing. But for those that were, actually it's from 2010 on, but if you were a convicted felon from prior to 2010, you actually have to apply to have your voters' rights restored. And there are a lot of folks out there that they don't even know that they have the right to get their voting rights restored.
Yeah, I think I'll just add to that. I tend to look at things a little more structurally and globally, but it's always interesting to me because we don't seem to question and we take for granted that you should lose your rights when you're convicted of a felony to begin with. And so one of the questions I always throw out is why, right? You're not less of a citizen just because you've been convicted of a crime, you know, particularly crimes like shoplifting or something like that. Why should that prevent you from voting, particularly when you look at the historical reasons for that? So when we talk about voting, and in particular Black folks voting, we tend to focus on the 15th Amendment and we forget about the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment was the amendment that outlawed slavery, but there's a big loophole in there, right? So you can't, it outlaws the badges and incidents of slavery, except for people who are duly convicted of felonies, right? And so part of the reason you have the Black codes, which Ms. Devine already mentioned, was it was a way to convict people of felonies for minor things. She mentioned like loitering, like not having a job right after you've been a slave and all of those things. And then use that as a way constitutionally then to eviscerate all of these rights, right? So if you can lose your right by conviction of a crime, when you have that history, it's really not a right, it's a privilege. And so I guess I would question, and of course it's one of the chief tactics of voter suppression for huge swaths of the country, and it has been for many, many years. But I would question why you should ever lose your right to vote. It seems to me that should be one of the most fundamental rights anyone has that you keep no matter what.
You know, it's interesting too, because under like the Wyoming statute, the restoration of rights only apply to nonviolent offenses, which seems strange to me because if you've complete one, going back to what Dr. Bridgman just says, why should you lose them at all? But two, if we're going to restore those rights and someone has completed their sentence, done everything that they were supposed to do according to their terms of their sentence and probation, I don't know why then the restoration of voting rights would apply only to nonviolent felonies. Something we need to push our legislators on.
No, I think that's a great point, and I really appreciate the, you know, the perception of the way that our government handles voting right now. Of it's treated more as a privilege, and I'm curious, especially in the consideration of how vastly felon voting rights vary just across states. Would you consider efforts like that make it really confusing for someone, even if they have been in prison, to figure out when and how they're eligible? Is it a stretch to consider efforts like that, just new and improved forms of say literacy tests and other restrictions that were largely ended or protected under the Voting Rights Act?
So I'm not quite sure what you're asking, Timber, sorry.
No, it's okay. I'm just wondering, like, because as we know that the rights for felons to vote varies drastically across state lines, and so I'm wondering if the confusion of in that process and the way that it varies so drastically, and ultimately the repercussions if somebody does try to vote and is not eligible, can we say that? Is it ridiculous to say that this is maybe just a new contemporary form of something like a literacy test, in which it is purposefully made extremely difficult to figure out when somebody can vote and how someone can vote?
I'm tossing that to you, Dr. Bridgman.
No, it's not ridiculous, right? It's very similar. You know, if you look back historically, literacy tests, poll taxes, moving polling places, grandfather clause, you know, there's always been a litany of tactics that have been used, right? So making it hard and different in different states, although different states have different rules for different reasons, right? As they say, all politics are local. So it may be easier to become enfranchised as a felon, or perhaps you don't even lose your rights as a felon in a particular state, because the folks in power in that state benefit from whatever that rule is, right? So the rules are going to vary by state depending on who's in power and who benefits from those rules. But yes, they're all meant to prevent people from voting. So it's not as though, I mean, if your end goal is to prevent people from voting and you make it difficult for no good reason for people to not vote, I don't think it matters, or it's a stretch, whether it's literacy test or some other kind of hurdle someone has to get over.
Yeah, we were talking about this yesterday, Timber, with Dr. Bridgman, that so in Florida, they had passed the voter restoration law, and that was on the ballot. So the voters said, you know, clearly they wanted felons to be able to vote. Then the Florida legislators then came about, and this is certainly a way of suppressing that vote, stating that felons still, before being able to vote, even if their sentence is complete, that they had to pay off fines, court fees, and things like that. So that I think it was the ACLU, you know, had a lawsuit against that. And the court at that time said that it's similar to a poll tax, which is illegal. And so they said that it was unconstitutional, but now the state of Florida is appealing that decision. And it's just interesting to me, the amount of time, money, and effort that so many of these states are putting into stopping people from voting.
And that leads perfectly into my next question of what would you all say motivates voter suppression?
You should start with this, Linda, so I don't go straight into my cynical view of the whole thing out of the gate.
Well, Dr. Bridgman says she's cynical, but I would say that it's more of a realist, right? So folks in legislatures around the country, they try to suppress the vote to keep people from voting, getting people of color, whether it's Black people, Hispanics, Native Americans, you know, they know that when people of color vote, that a lot of them are going to start losing power. And that's what, to me, I think it just is about power and control. There's a lot of fear when the so-called majority start losing power, and marginalized communities are able to start exercising their rights to vote. And that's just the reality of it.
Yeah, when I think about that, you know, why do you suppress the vote? Why do we do such a poor job, right, of having a functional democracy in this country that puts itself up as the beacon of democracy? And a lot of it's power, right? And it's not, you know, we focus a lot, and certainly in this context, on people of color and tactics directed to them. But if you look back historically, what you really don't want to do is have the masses come together collectively and rise up and take power against you, right? We don't have majority rule. We have minority rule, in part through these suppressive tactics. And the big reason for that's all about power, right? And maintaining power, maintaining supremacy, which you cannot do if you have a functional democracy where everybody down at the bottom comes together for their collective good against you, right? And so we have this long history of dividing by race, by gender, by social class, by all of these things, because you can't maintain power if all of those folks come together and rise up against you. But as we've talked about, I'm not Pollyanna and light about this, right? So I apologize in advance.
No, I think you're absolutely valid in this critical view of the dysfunction of our democracy and the faux pas to call ourselves a true representative democracy, because as you've noted, there has always been long strided efforts to really concentrate the power and the power to vote with only certain demographics. And so to sort of shift gears, I'm interested in your all's perspective of how has historical and contemporary segregation played a role in the disproportionate impacts we see in voter suppression, particularly in the form of gerrymandering and other redistricting efforts.
I can jump in on this one. And I see some folks in the chat had some gerrymandering questions, right? And one of the things that's interesting, you know, and a lot of times we tend to focus on one issue, right? So we're talking about voting and voting suppression here, but you really have interlocking systems of oppression. And so you can't have gerrymandering, or gerrymandering is not effective if you don't have residential segregation, right? So you can engage in certain gerrymandering tactics like packing and stacking and all these different things that keep happening, especially with communities of color, if they're all living together, right? If they're dispersed across your geographical areas, gerrymandering doesn't work very well and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? So those two have always worked in combination. And you can see how that's an effect, because if you look at some of these gerrymandering maps, right, they've had some crazy ones out of Texas that were, for example, that were challenged. When you have those, you know, normal people would just craft a district, right, make a square, whatever you would do. When you get these weird shapes of districts, you can see that they're grouping together all the people that live together, that they're trying to put in one place for those gerrymandering tactics, right? So you almost have to have the residential segregation. And those are two interlocking, mutually reinforcing systems.
Okay, Mayor, I think going back to like the whole, excuse me, we talked about power and folks losing, starting to lose power. And so they want to try to find different ways to suppress votes of where people might start changing how things look. And I think that especially after the 2016 election, and then with our recent census, that there's more of an effort to try and change those districts. And if you look over, especially like in Georgia, where for the first time, you know, they produced some Democrat, you know, voted for the president as a Democrat and 2 senators. And so that's an area where they're working really hard to redistrict those areas and to suppress the vote of Black people.
Absolutely, absolutely. And with the Supreme Court vote of shooting down a large portion of the Voting Rights Act, of allowing states with historical discriminatory voting practices to sort of be on their own fruition and not have to go through that federal process of allowing them or to certify their redistricting. It seems like you know, just the beginning of a very slippery slope that even government protections are not necessarily going to protect people against. So I'd like to go to the chat to see what do you all see the role of the courts in the current redistricting maps that are currently being drawn? And I'd like to further that a little bit and see if you all have any ideas of ways of new ideas that can be implemented that maybe take the power of redistricting out of the current hands it's in now.
Well, I think Dr. Bridgman shared an article with us earlier today about there being, I don't know if it was a nonpartisan or what was that, Jackie, on for the redistricting.
Yeah, the nonpartisan citizen committees, right? Go ahead. It's just answering your question.
Well, so, you know, because right now, as it is, whoever's in control at the legislature are the ones that really get to decide the redistricting, right? So if you're in a Republican controlled legislature and they get the chance to start to redistrict, when it comes to you know, the courts and how are they, you know, what was the question? how can the courts be involved or something like that. So today, the Wyoming or the US Supreme Court overturned a lower decision from Alabama because the lower court had ruled that the redistricting was affecting Black communities. And so then that was appealed up to the United States Supreme Court, and on a 5-4 decision. Well, first of all, the lower court um, instituted an injunction preventing the use of that redistricting map for the elections. But now the Supreme Court lifted that injunction. They didn't give a reason why. And, you know, when they do hear it, it's probably not going to be until after the November election. So another reason why it's so important that we're able to get folks elected where we can get Supreme Court justices that are going to be more favorable to making sure that voters' rights are protected.
Yeah, so role of the courts, what I would like to see in my utopian view of the world, right, is that the courts acted as that third branch, right? We have three branches that are supposed to function as checks and balances on each other. Right now, I think the legislative branch and even the executive branch, right? So the president, your governors at a state level have no incentive to create a system that allows full participation by the populace, right? They don't benefit from that. So you have the folks who benefit the most from the screwed up system gerrymandering that we have setting the rules, right? And so I think the only place really, you know, as long as people can overcome all the voter suppression and vote, that's one option possibly. But I think the other place, if the courts did their job in this area like they should, and like they did to a large extent before the Voting Rights Act, the 1964 Voting Rights Act was gutted through a Supreme Court decision, you know, they can act as a check on the other branches, right? And they could enforce the idea of one person, one vote, and prevent, by making it unconstitutional or whatever, the legislative branches from setting up systems that benefit them, right? And require things like nonpartisan citizen groups or something along those lines to set those districts. But right now, our courts don't function that way, at least at the higher levels. Some of the district courts certainly do and have. The Supreme Court has sometimes in the past, but right now that isn't the case. So I'd love to see the courts step in and actually rule in favor of broader democracy for the people. But I don't know. I mean, never happened.
This is where my cynicism probably shows up, which is in the role of the courts, because I just think it's become so partisan, especially at the Supreme Court, but the lower courts as well. And, you know, they're supposed to be that separate branch of government. And to me, it's kind of it's very disappointing to see how far they've gone to the right. Not to the right, not as incorrect, but to the right as in really conservative.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that brings up an interesting point that I think perfectly ties into Morgan's question. What would, if voting theoretically became mandatory in the United States, how would this impact modern day voter suppression? Or would it totally circumvent and not have us worry about it anymore?
But I didn't hear the question on that. Sorry, I was looking at it in the chat room.
If voting were to become mandatory, how do you think it would affect modern day voter suppression?
Well, I think it would help, right? If everyone had to vote. You know, and I don't know, so mandatory can mean a lot of things, right? What does that look like? I certainly think it would be helpful if we went, so one of the things, if you go with mandatory voting, is your underlying assumptions about voting shift quite a bit, right? It becomes a requirement that everyone has to do, rather than this carefully held privilege that we exclude so many people from, right? So I think there'd be value from a voter suppression standpoint, just from that shift in thinking. And hopefully then if it's mandatory, you would get the resources and whatever else to make it easier for everyone to vote. And we do that. It's always funny to me, right? Because you have to register, especially if you're a man, with selective service. I don't know why we don't automatically require registration for voting, right, at the same time when you turn 18. You could easily do that. I always think, especially during the time that I've been a judge, what's your enforcement mechanism for that? So, it's nice to throw around terms like, we'll require mandatory voting, but then what do you do when people don't vote? What's the penalty for that? What's the enforcement mechanism? Which I think gets a little bit hard. But you could certainly make it a whole lot easier and closer to mandatory for people than we do here, if your goal was to actually get everybody participating in the democracy.
Well, I would agree with Dr. Bridgman that I think, when you turn 18, there should be just an automatic voter registration. I don't think, maybe this comes to my role as a criminal defense attorney and civil rights, whatever, is like, I don't know that I would be comfortable with making something like that mandatory, because then again, you're having a government get involved on what you should or should not do, or what you have to do. And I think that it just comes back to two, is just more education. And so many people are cynical and they think that their vote doesn't count. And I think it's just really important for us to continue getting all that information out there and educating people how every single vote does matter.
Absolutely. There's definitely, I think, more risk maybe than reward if making voting mandatory compared to maybe easier efforts and more attainable efforts of just making it largely more accessible, while also, somehow working with the population that has been that has lost, whether it be faith or interest in the democratic process, and somehow getting those people back into having faith in the process and feeling motivated to vote. So how would you all go about improving voters' rights and lessening the impacts of voter suppression if you could create this utopia?
Go for it, Jackie.
Oh, I have a long list, right? How much time do we have left? No. So I think some of it's mindset, right? Treat it like a real right that we guarantee and enforce. So there's lots of things you can do. One, you got to make registration easier. You've got to make access easier with technology. Despite what everyone says, if I can pay my taxes online, I don't see why I can't vote online. You can do all kinds of things. Why do we vote on a Tuesday in the middle of the winter? Where most places it's cold, it's hard to stand out there. That makes no sense. So you can move it to the summer. You can vote all week long. You can have many ways. And a lot of states do this in some ways now, right? Many ways to access. So there are tons of things you can do, most of which don't cost that much money, aren't that hard to do, can certainly be made secure. So one of the things we do is act like access to voting is hard, right? Or we don't know how to do it. And it's interesting to me because we always assume people won't participate in voting, even if you don't have these suppression mechanisms. But when you think about it, in this country and in our culture, we vote all the time. We make almost all collective decisions in groups on the basis of a vote, right? From the time you're little all the way up. So it's sort of in our DNA. You just have to make it easy for people to do. You could do drive-by voting. The list is quite long, but I think you would have to come from the perspective of how do we enfranchise as many people as we can? How do we make this as easy as we can? And if you start from that premise, the answer is really pretty simple, right? There are tons of things you can do to make it easy for people to vote. We do very little of those, but you can certainly do it. And I can put the list in the chat or whatever. I got tons of ideas on that.
Ms. Devine, any ideas on your side of things of how to?
Everything she said, I completely agree with.
You had a great teacher.
Yeah, exactly.
So Aaron in the chat wants to know, and we sort of, hinted at this with who is in control of redistricting and who can influence gerrymandering. If the people in power are the ones who ultimately, determine these voter regulations, how do we break the current cycle? It seems evident that both parties have not made any, at least overt, interests or efforts to directly increase voter enfranchisement. There's a lot of just sort of, I think, very minimal middle of the road efforts from both sides, really, that don't necessarily, I think, inherently focus on getting the larger populace out to vote. So what can be done to combat these impacts of voter suppression tactics and avoid this, in Aaron's words, self-fulfilling prophecy that will continue to perpetuate the system of power abuse?
So I can start with that one, especially with the gerrymandering. I mean, right now, it's being discussed in so many different state legislators, and what we can do is get involved. And it may not be the most interesting of areas to be involved in, but like here in Wyoming, they've had committee meetings on video or on Zoom. I know that there's been messages sent out letting folks know about it. And it's like, you got to get involved in these meetings and letting your legislators know if you support or oppose these redistricting measures. And because if you don't get out there and if you don't start letting your voice be heard, you're right, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I know it can be discouraging, and I know that there's a sense of gloom and doom sometimes, but if you don't get out there and you don't let your legislators know what you think and how you feel about the proposed maps, they're just going to go through and vote on it the way that they want. But if they start getting pressure from their constituents, then things might actually change. And a lot of folks don't even really understand the whole thing with the gerrymandering. And it's like every 10 years maps are redrawn, and it's just something that folks really need to become aware of and get involved with, in my humble opinion.
Yeah, I would agree with Ms. Devine, but I'd probably take it a step forward, right? And I'm looking at both, I think, Matthew's comments here in the chat about the ballot and the bullet, as well as, our statewide national grassroots movements enough. I think we're to a point, right? I almost hesitate to say this out loud, but it's me, so I will, where I'm not sure how much of this can be fixed within the system anymore. Given the seats of power, given how corrupt it is, if it ever could be, right? I think we've had illusions over time that things have been fixed and gotten better. And in some ways, I think that's true. But on the whole, I think this only maybe gets fixed by having sort of the equivalent of an uprising, which I very much hope would be nonviolent, right? But you're going to have to do organizing, I think, by the masses and get people out to vote, not just in president elections, but in all your local elections, right? It's not your national folks who gerrymander, it's your state legislators that gerrymander. And so you've got to get out and vote in those elections, and you've got to organize people to vote. So yeah, there are all these voter suppression tactics, but people can still vote when there's voter suppression, right? And so, and you saw that, I think, in the last presidential election in Georgia. There are all kinds of, they have new laws they've passed, but there were plenty of voter suppression laws in place, and there was just a lot of really good grassroots organizing that helped get around that, right? And so you're just going to have to get a critical mass, and I don't know if we can do it as a country or a nation, of people, and I think nonpartisan, right? It doesn't do us any good at the bottom to keep having these red and blue and conservative and not conservative fights, because we're all getting screwed by everybody at the top. So at some point, I think everybody at the bottom is going to have to come together and organize. And we've done that to certain extents over the course of our history. And I think we're coming up at a time when we need to do it again. And I think if that doesn't happen, these divisions continue. And you either get everybody the ballot to the extent that they feel they really can participate, or people find other ways to get their needs and issues addressed. And those don't tend to be peaceful and supportive of whatever that system is. So that's my, what's a word? Stronger than cynical, probably response to that. But I think that's where we're at.
And I think too, just following up on that too, is, when you talk about getting the masses involved in grassroots organization, a lot of times you see so many different organizations out there that are focused on a certain issue. And it's like, I wonder sometimes if you could get these different organizations to join forces, because you can have someone, that's really passionate about reproductive rights, and then, they get involved in all these things. And then you can have someone that's some folks that are really, focused on, Black Lives Matter or LGBTQT, and so if you could find a way to get all of these different organizations, right, and bring your voices together, because folks can get really gung-ho about something, and then perhaps the issue that they're working on, is taken care of, and maybe they move on to other things. But just staying in tune to how so many different groups' rights are affected, and just finding a way to join forces. That's my still trying to stay positive view.
And both are valuable. We have to work within the context we're in, and put in our back pocket the revolutionary side of that. I think both have value in the immediate and long-term future. And Nancy brings up a great point in the chat of you can't necessarily outvote gerrymandering. And we've even seen in states like Georgia, where some of these, what I would consider grassroots effort to motivate people to vote, like providing food and water at lines at polls, are even not safe anymore or legal anymore to do. And so there's only so much, that grassroots organizing can do against a system that so heavily values not having the majority of the populace actively voting. But it's definitely, more and more, as we see, especially with the Voting Rights Acts getting gutted, it seems like the government is just more and more uninterested in ensuring that more people can vote. And you have to wonder why that is. Another question in the chat asks, do you think that voter suppression affects poor groups similarly to people of color, in the idea that the legislature does not want to lose power to the poor? Or are those two groups distinguishable, or how are they different, and how does voter suppression impact them differently?
Before we go to that question, sorry, I was stuck back here on Nancy's comment when we go to that, about this idea that you can't outvote gerrymandering. And I wonder though, if you can out-organize it, right? Gerrymandering works, as we said, because you have segregation, but you also have divisions, right? The assumption underlying gerrymandering is that if you put all the white folks in one group together and the black folks in another, or whatever, or all the folks we consider to be red or blue, they're going to vote in certain ways, right? But if you look at a lot of the polling across issues, not party lines, there's a lot more consensus across the country about a number of things. And so if in fact, I think you could get people to vote their interest beyond a single issue or beyond their party affiliation, then gerrymandering doesn't really work for you anymore, right? Because the underlying assumptions would no longer be true. So I just want to throw that out because you got me thinking. And I think Amber touched on that in her comment in the chat, right? About getting like-minded people together. So I think as long as you continue to allow people to be divided and conquered, then all these tactics work, right? And so some of that effort, and I don't think there's been a lot lately of that grassroots organizing, I think needs to come towards bringing people together across all of these lines, rather than just getting your constituents and your blue space or red space out to do what you want them to do in furtherance of the power structure. Okay, sorry, I don't even remember the other question now.
No, it's okay. And I thought of another one, just thinking, because I could totally see the value and the impact that grassroots organizing around getting people out to vote and how beneficial that would be. But I'm wondering how, we can always say, well, we can educate people, but how do we truly reach these people that have lost faith in this system? Because we can knock on their doors, we can offer incentives to go to the polls, but there has to be an ideological shift, I think, for a large portion of the population that just absolutely doesn't believe in the system anymore. How do you think that we can circumvent those people and get them, show them the value in voting?
And I maybe it's just because I'm older, that I see things differently and still want to just believe that we can still do these things and motivate people. I mean, we've had conversations, me with a lot of the 30 and under folks on how to stay involved. And I know it can be discouraging. And I just look back over the history of things, and even me as 60 years old, that things have changed through the years, that have gotten better, and have things gotten worse for some groups too. Yeah, that happens, but it's like the 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And I think if you focus on what's not being done, that's when you can get discouraged and cynical and bitter and not want to stay engaged. And I hesitate to even say these things because I speak from a white woman with that certain amount of privilege, and so I don't want to sound like, oh, you just got to get out there and do what's right and everything's going to be okay, because I know that's not true. But if you quit believing that your vote matters, then what's the alternative? What is the alternative to not staying involved and voting? I mean, the alternative is that we continue to lose our rights, and what rights that some folks have, continue to disappear. And so I guess my response is, what's the alternative to that?
I would agree with that. I think too, one way to maybe do it is to think differently about engagement and when you engage and when it's effective, right? Of course, in this panel, we're focused on voting. So often when we think about voter suppression and grassroots organizing, we think about voting in big elections and voting in the presidential election, right? But I think there are a lot of ways for people to engage that make a difference even outside of traditional systemic politics, right? So for example, recently, I believe it's in Virginia, they're banning various kinds of books, you know, and so they have a hotline set up and it gets flooded by all these young folks, I'll say that, you know, going to Twitter, going on TikTok, whatever they're doing, calling up the hotline to make those suppression tactics and censoring tactics ineffective, right? And so I think sometimes you don't have to have every single person involved in everything, but I think there are different ways that you can get people involved, even for smaller things like that, right? So they may not have gone out and voted the person who chooses to censor all of these titles, but you might get them involved in the effort to prevent those censoring acts from happening, right, in real time. And so I think some of this is people who look at grassroots organizing have a pretty narrow view of what that looks like and when it's effective and when it should be deployed. And now with technology and the ability to communicate, I think there are lots of things you can do at a lot of different levels if you're more creative and thoughtful about what you're doing and what your goals are.
I absolutely agree, and I do think, and I'm thankful for this younger generation that is getting involved in these unconventional ways. I think there is a lot of value in those efforts, but you have to wonder, or I am left to wonder, you know, you can prod the bear, but you know, how do we get these younger people then that are motivated in these unconventional ways of getting organized to get organized or motivated to maybe run for office or to actually, you know, take these positions of power, because along with the ideological, I think, negative perspective on voting, that's even furthered by the idea of actually, you know, getting into government and running and just hearing the horror stories of the bureaucratic process and you know, making people sort of live with and work with this idea of the slow churning incremental machine. Is there a way that we can motivate these people to take these tactics further in a conventional route? And is that where they can provide the most benefit?
I was just gonna say that, with respect to getting younger folks and involved in voting, that, you know, when you have this two-party system, and then you get, you know, some younger folks that are running, and then they get in there, and then they're constantly being corralled into like voting the party position. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but I really feel like that it's time for like a legitimate third party. Um, that you know, when you get in there and you're able to vote your conscience and not vote the way that you're, whether it's Republican or Democrat, right? Because both parties do it. And you know, I don't know. I really kind of feel like we need to start looking seriously about a third party. I don't know. I'm out of answers.
Yeah, I don't know what the answer is. I think you do a piece of this though, or maybe part of the answer is I think there has to be some leadership development, right? Because you do have to have people to vote for, right? And what does that look like? And if you look, you know, historically, Black Panthers and some others had some real good leadership development. And of course, those things are, and it's always hard because anytime you make progress in those ways, outside of voter suppression, right, you get all this pushback and backlash. And so when those innovative ideas and tactics and leadership development or whatever go forward, it is hard to move those things forward because the power establishment will do all kinds of things, you know. And I know Dr. Dixon talks about this in all his classes, right? The use of the FBI and the full weight of the government to suppress all of those kinds of efforts. So I think one of the things to think about, and as Ms. Devine said, it's an ongoing process. I think one of the things that happens, and part of why people don't engage, is you expect that you do one thing and it fixes all your problems, right? But it is an ongoing struggle for change that lasts. And so developing leaders that can stick in there, developing structures that can survive the assault they'll be subjected to, undoubtedly, and then doing that over time. And I think that's a hard thing, right? That kind of change doesn't happen overnight. It's not permanent without continued tending and work. And so some of that's mindset, but no easy answers, which is hard.
No, absolutely. And we are, I believe, right at our hour mark. So just to finish up and to tie it back into the theme of this Black History Month conference, when we think about the Negro question and the exploitation of people, how do we, because when I think of the Negro question as it relates to voter suppression, I think of it as an extension of somewhat of the 3/5 compromise, of where there is a large population of people that are contributing to the political power of some, in a sense of how much representation people get. So what is to be done? You know, I mean, not in the sense of how do we stop voter suppression, but how do we move forward in a grand sense to reverse the impacts? Is it possible to reverse the impacts of voter suppression? Or how would you all, I guess, let me take a step back. What is the connection that you all see between the Negro question and voter suppression, and the historical basis of, do you see the similarities of these tactics expanding acts like the 3/5 compromise, of where there is a stronghold on getting people to be counted toward your populace, but not getting those people to vote? That was sort of a loaded question. Let me know if it doesn't make sense.
You tackle that one, Dr. Bridgman.
So are you asking, and I think some of this we've touched on already, right? So if your question is, how does the present day tie back to, like the questions at the Mohawk conference, and this idea of, we'll count you as as part of the populace, we'll use your labor or whatever, and give you no rights of citizenship. I think what you see today is the legacy of that, right? It continues. And I think, when you make some progress, you get somewhat comfortable and think things are better, or you can spin the narrative that things are better. And certainly they are, but that certainly doesn't mean that there isn't a whole lot more work to do, right? And I tend to be one of these people that believes in true democracy, and I don't think we're anywhere near there. And part of the reason, if you look historically, I think that we have never had a truly functioning democracy is because of the Negro question, right? We have never wanted people of color, Black folks in particular, to have access to that power structure. And so you have 3/5 clause, you've got voter suppression out of the gate for all of your folks, again, on the bottom, because you want to maintain power and be able to exploit everybody who's working for you and contributing to your wealth. Sorry, but I'll be hopeful for half a second, right, though, but I still continue to think you work on these things, because I do believe in democracy, right? And I do believe that there is power within the people to make positive change. And when you look historically, when we've made progress, we don't make progress because somebody at the top says, oh, now we'll give you all something good. We make progress because people at the bottom pitch a royal fit, and finally they have no choice but to move some things forward. So I have faith in people, at least as a collective, as they move forward, maybe not individuals. I don't have a lot of faith in the power structure to make change that's not in their own interest and that erodes their own power.
That's where I would, following up with Dr. Bridgman, is that when legislators do, change things, it's not because all of a sudden they were enlightened and feel like, we need to change the law, yada, yada. It's because this mass of people are coming forward and they really don't have a whole, lot of choice. And that's where I would go back and try to, where I keep that hope alive is just keep, people getting engaged, staying engaged, get on your, put your tennis shoes on or whatever and get your boots on the ground and keep working and keep organizing. It's not fun and it's not easy, and it's not going to, you can't get complacent when you win a victory because you know, and even like over the last couple of years, there've been, with some criminal justice reform, you might see something change in a particular state, but you barely have time to sit back and enjoy that victory because you got to start with the next one, right? You start tackling the next issue. And that's where I'm just saying it's a continuous struggle. And it's just something that we have to keep pushing forward on. And having good support systems and that you can rely on and, vent and collaborate, and brainstorm and scream and yell at.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that was a beautiful way to tie up the conversation and really harp on the value that grassroots in a multitude of forms can not only make a true difference, but keep people motivated to believe in that difference and to believe in democracy, or if not, construct a concrete alternative to it that can also be implemented. It has to come from the bottom. It has to come from the people, and that the power with the people doesn't necessarily start or stop at the ballot, but it really is, I believe in finding our similarities and finding our mutual enemies and attacking them head on. So I'd like to thank you both so much, Miss Linda and Dr. Bridgman, for joining us tonight, and all of our wonderful guests. Thank you all for your wonderful questions and participating tonight. I will open it back up to Dr. Dixon to see if he has any closing remarks, if he is still here.
I am. Very enlightening conversation. Thanks for all the questions. When we think about the days and times, and there have been many times where we've been saddled with or burdened with these kinds of dynamics. I think right now in our country, as my students said, they left at 7 o'clock on time. They were out the door at 7 o'clock. And they explained to me that there is an air of disgust, and there's also an air of not wanting to be involved. And now these are young folks. So this isn't the first time that we've seen this in America. And I do believe what Dr. Jackie said, that we are normally pulled out of some of these things by a phenomenon, but I don't think we can wait on the phenomenon. I think we have to do the work in itself on a regular basis, but I can understand fully how anyone could be very disheartened with our political system and the trajectory that it's taken. So to think about the Negro question goes back to exactly what Dr. Jackie is saying. When it comes to voter suppression, it's one portion of a long dehumanization process. And from where we are right now, I think it is on an uptick. I think we'll have to deal with it in a way that deals directly with a response to the response. And when we do see progress, one of the things that becomes very obvious is what they call white massive resistance. And that's what we're seeing now. You think about Barack Obama as being a watershed moment. And then that leads to the election of Donald Trump, which leads to the election of our current president. All of these play in concert, none of them are alone. But I still do have hope. But I was always taught as a closing comment, 9 times out of 10, when you see a politician's mouth moving, it's a lie. So that is behind the scenes, and that to me is the way that I look. That's my theoretical perspective. But I do have hope, and I hope that young people don't lose hope. But that being the case, I can thank you all for another wonderful conversation. And we'll be back next Monday with a dynamite conversation about Negro question and the Black quarterback. So I think it'll be time to have that discussion again. As the conversations are moving, so is the months and the days and the months. And we are on a roll, if you will. So I thank all of you all for taking your time. So good to see Timberly back in the fold with the old crew.
Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Dixon. It was an honor.
We really miss you. So, keep doing what you're doing, but we really do.
Absolutely. I will be back soon. Don't worry. I gotta get some divine eat food.
Thank you, Ms. Linda.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right,
Thank you,
everybody.
Mr. Richmond. Thank you, Miss Linda.
Thank you, Toby. Way to